So, yes, microphone's working. Welcome everybody. I'm really happy to be hosting the first urban talk here in Umeå. It's an initiative from SLU Urban Futures, I think it's SLU Urban Futures, the official name. They have had talks in Uppsala and Alnarp, but not yet in Umeå, so I'm really happy that we now extended the urban stuff here. And I'm really happy that you're all here. Today, we will have a talk of Dr. Roland Kays. Roland is the head of the Biodiversity Lab at the North Carolina Museum for Natural Sciences and a research associate professor at the NC State. He's a zoologist working on many things, amongst others kinkajous in the treetops in Panama. He has worked on maneless lions in Kenya. He was one of the people discovering the olinguito, but today we'll be talking about animal adaptations to survive the Anthropocene. So please give a warm welcome to Roland Kays.
Well, thanks, Tim, and thanks everyone for coming and for inviting me. It's fun to come here, my first visit to Sweden, and as part of a sort of extended collaboration between North Carolina State University. I've met some of you folks in Raleigh, and it's fun to come and see you. And this is, I guess, what Sweden's always like, right? Sunshine and springtime, so it's great. So today I'm gonna sort of talk about a couple different research projects and that I've been involved with, and how they're sort of looking at how animals are adapting to survive in the Anthropocene. And I think a lot of times when we think about the Anthropocene, we think about pictures like this, the Earth at night. We think about how humans are sort of taking over the planet. And the term Anthropocene is kind of a geology term that's been coined. If you look back at the history of Earth, geologists have all these different scenes, right? These different eras of Earth that are characterized by different things that were the dominant in terms of the biology or geology or atmosphere of the planet. And they're sort of recognizing that we are probably in a new era that is characterized by how much of a huge impact humans have. And maybe that started in 1950, maybe that started in 1700. Geologists don't really worry about the hundreds of years, it's the sort of thousands of years. But clearly, we are in there today. And I think this is a kind of an interesting way to look at how this has happened. This is some work out of the University of Maryland, what they call the anthromes, which are sort of how much of an effect are humans having on the planet. And so you can see their estimates from 1700, where just a small part of the planet was used by humans in things like settlements, villages, croplands, and rangelands, and most of it was semi-natural or natural in various types of sort of natural ecosystems. And when you look at how this changes to the 1800s, to the 1900s, and to 2000, you can see how now most of the planet is used, more than half of the planet is used in some way, with some of it being sort of natural and a smaller extent being wild. So this is what we're dealing with, and these kind of maps come largely from remote sensing. These satellites that can view the planet from above and get these global scale images of what's going on in terms of land use. We have these types of this type of information for what's going on in terms of climate, for example, showing global warming in a lot of these areas. But if you want to know what's going on with wildlife, most of these animals can't be seen from satellites, with the exception of maybe some penguin colonies that were in the news recently. But otherwise, a lot of this wildlife is harder to census and to sample and to see what's going on with populations. We know from work, on the ground that some species are not doing very well, right? Some of the Asian rhinos are going increasingly extinct. But we also know that some species are doing just fine, thank you very much. They quite like some of the anthropogenic habitats. And so this is kind of, I think, what we have to be looking at is which species are doing well, which species are not doing well, what are the causes of both of those, and how can we help species to adapt and survive. And for sure, when I'm talking about adaptations, a lot of what I'm talking about are behaviors, right? The behaviors are some of the things that can evolve the fastest. They can even be learned. They can evolve faster than some of the morphological things. And we're seeing some new behaviors, some of which are quite shocking, quite surprising. For example, leopards in India are increasingly feeding on dogs. And here's a leopard sneaking actually into the atrium of an apartment building in India and attacking a domestic dog that's sleeping there, which is a little disturbing if you like dogs. But it shows that this is quite an amazing thing for a wild, large carnivore to do. And in North Carolina, gray squirrels have learned how to grab nut candy bars and sneak them out of drugstores. So, where is this going? You can see the residents of North Carolina are completely shocked at this, quite alarmed. I want to talk a little bit about evolution. What is evolution? How does it work, right? It needs variation. There need to be these variants in behavior or morphology that can then, some of them survive better than others. So one of the problems, if you have a population that's really small, there's no variation. If a new disease comes, or there's just kind of no option for evolution and adaptation. The other thing is that it can be population specific, right? You can have something going on with the red foxes here in Umeå that's different than the red foxes down in Stockholm because they're different populations. And so they can have different evolutionary pressures that select for different types of things. And then it can be fast. We often think of evolution as happening in millions of years, but we're finding increasingly when we look at behavior and we look with increasingly sensitive genetic tools that we can find evolution happening in a few generations, in a few decades for different species. And I like to think about evolution also including learning. Learning is, if there's a behavior that is passed on from a mom to an offspring or something like that, and that it is then passed on again, it may or may not be genetically coded, but it still is a trait that is being passed on that could affect survival. And so from my point of view today, I would talk, whether it's learning or whether it's genetic, it doesn't necessarily matter to me. So what I want to talk about is give some examples of how carnivores, in particular mammals, are adapting to survive in the Anthropocene. Maybe think about some of the common factors promoting that adaptation and highlight some successes from North America. And then I'll end by talking about some of our citizen science camera trapping, which is some of what we were talking about getting started here locally as well. So in North America, we had a really massive conservation crisis that came from two major things that were happening at once. One was we were over-harvesting lots of wildlife, and we were persecuting the predators. So here you can see a bunch of guys have a coyote tied up. There you can see a bunch of wolves that were being persecuted and driven out of the area. And at the same time, we lost our forests. You can see what we originally had in terms of forest cover and what we had by 1920 in terms of old-growth forests. So in the early 1900s, by 1920, our carnivore populations were at an all-time low. Our forests had really been devastated. And when you look today and you see pictures like this, you think, oh my God, this must be a terrible place. But in fact, a lot of the forests have regrown. And so it was not all turned into farmland or agriculture. This is a picture of forest cover today. You can see the East Coast has a lot of green on it. When you look at Raleigh, where I live in North Carolina, we have, downtown Raleigh's got a lot of pavement, but by the time you get 10 miles, I should have put this in kilometers, sorry. Anyway, 10 miles, 20 miles out of town, you get a lot of forest cover. And when you get further out, you get a mix of forest and fields. The point is there is a lot of forest. If you can figure out as an animal how to live around these houses, how to live around these farm fields, there's still quite a lot of forested habitat. The other thing that I think is really important for a lot of wildlife species in North America is the amount of hunting that's going on, right? We have estimated 13 million hunters, which to get that many people with guns, you would have to assemble the combined armies of China, USA, India, North Korea, Russia. Actually, the 19 largest armies in the world combined equals the amount of people that go out with guns every year hunting wildlife in the United States. Some of them are better than others. Some of them are going after different species. But for sure, there's going to be an impact on the wildlife populations and on the behavior of these wildlife populations. And that's going to be different in the rural areas from the cities because there's no hunting in the cities. And so we looked at this to some extent. We looked at studies. So the best way to study the mortality of animals is you put radio collars on them and you follow them around till they die, and then you try to figure out why they died. Right? That's the best way to determine what are the types of things that are causing the mortality of species. And so we looked at a bunch of different studies, and specifically looking at the carnivores. This was 26 studies, 12 different species we found 65 different dead animals. And what was the cause of that? Related to the human footprint, which is just kind of a 0 to 100 measure of development level. And so what we found was that in the areas that had a high human footprint, very low percent of the mortality was from hunting. But once you get out into the rural or wild areas that have lower human footprint, you have, in some cases, 80 or so percent of the mortality is coming from human hunters, some of it legal, some of it illegal. So the point is that the evolutionary selection pressures that are facing these populations in the rural areas, hunting, I think, is very important. Now, what's interesting is that this is well-managed hunting, right? The populations are not going extinct. The populations, for the most part, are doing fine of any of the managed populations in North America. But I do want to mention, in other parts of the world, this hunting and trapping is not nearly as well regulated. Here you can see a poacher carrying a pangolin in Africa with a couple porcupine tails coming out of its backpack. So, in other parts of the world, this does cause probably evolution and conservation issues. In North America, and I think in Sweden as well, it's probably more of an evolutionary thing than an extinction crisis. So, in fact, in North America, we do find carnivores surviving in or near cities. The mountain lion population in California is one of the most famous. They didn't go extinct and then come back. They've still been surviving there. They're not really moving through neighborhoods. They're living in the natural areas right next to the neighborhood. This is a famous picture from National Geographic. But it's happening in other places as well. This is just a college buddy of mine who sent me this picture. He lives outside of Boulder, Colorado, and this mountain lion moved through his backyard. And so it is happening in other places where they are surviving and doing well. And I think what's interesting is also to look at how some of these behaviors change over time. So wolves in North America are also doing a lot better. They've received protection in a lot of areas. They've been reintroduced in some areas. In the Great Lakes states, so this is Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota area, they never went extinct. They received protection. They started coming back naturally on their own, and they're doing quite well. You can see the lower line is the number of packs. The upper line is the number of wolves over time. And I thought it was interesting to look at what type of habitats they used over this time period. So in the early 90s, there was a paper that looked at, well, where are wolves living? And they found road density was really important. And that there was a threshold where over 0.45 kilometers of road per kilometer squared, you didn't have wolves. And then a couple years later, they said, oh, well, yeah, there's a threshold, but it's actually a little bit different, a little bit higher. And then a couple years later, they said, oh, actually, the average road density is that level. So the point is these animals are changing their habitat preferences as they receive protection. They weren't so afraid of roads, and they were able to recover. And what we thought we knew about wolves at one period of time was different just, 15 years later. And I think we've seen this in Europe as well, where the wolf population has been recovering. And I know I have some friends in Denmark who the whole country just seems to be flabbergasted that they have wolves actually now breeding in Denmark. But I think that shows the adaptability. If you give some protection, these animals can change what we think their behavior preferences are and can survive. And so I'm going to give a little bit more detail onto a project that we did with fishers. Fishers are kind of like a really big marten. The females are about 2 kilos, the males are sort of 4 to 6 kilos, and they have really nice fur. And so, in this point when I talked about in the United States when we were over-harvesting everything, they were really driven to low points. Their populations were crashing, but now they've made quite a comeback. You can see some modern fur trapping in some parts. There's still fur trappers working with fishers, and their populations are doing fine. But what's interesting, when I was in college, Roger Powell was kind of the guy that I like fishers and was read some of his work, and they published that fishers are habitat specialists that require mature forests. They were sort of the old growth species that we need to keep track of. And part of the reason I think they thought that was, by 1920 they were reduced to these red areas. So the gray area is where we think they were originally. The green area is the red area is showing where they were reduced to at their low point, which were some old growth forests. But in fact, today now they've recovered through some reintroductions and through lots of natural expansion to cover all those green areas. Basically, in the East Coast, they're doing great. In the mountain states, they're doing okay. In the West Coast, they seem to need some help. They're recovering a lot slower. They're not being reintroduced as well. But so, given that I knew fishers as a wilderness species, I was really surprised in 2000 to get this camera trap picture of a fisher in Albany, New York, where I lived at the time. And this was a habitat where we got this fisher, right? So this is suburban Albany. You can see the houses, a little nature preserve. There's the mall up there, the university. This was suburbia, right? This was not old-growth forest. This was even sort of this scrappy pine forest. So I worked with Scotland Point to do a tracking study with these fishers. We put some GPS tracking collars on them. We did a lot of snow tracking to see what they were doing. We found that we collected a bunch of scats, and we found that they're eating a lot of gray squirrels, which happen to be super common in North Carolina, hitting everyone's bird feeders. Sorry, this is New York, not North Carolina. They're common in North Carolina, too. Cottontail rabbits were very popular. They weren't killing deer, right? If they could find a deer in the winter, they chew on it all winter long. This was some of the rest sites they were using. So this was what I thought was an old-growth specialist, hiding under garbage piles, sleeping in sort of in little brush piles behind people's houses. Sometimes they would go up in these squirrel nests. We called them fisher bed and breakfast. And even in holes in the ground. From our camera trap data, we made some comparisons between the urban areas and an area about an hour outside of town where there was a more wild state park areas. And just in terms of the relative abundance from our camera traps, it looked like they were actually much more common. We were getting many more pictures of fishers in the urban area. We looked at their activity period, and this is showing on the top graph is from the tracking data, and it shows that they're active at night. At about 6 or 7 a.m., they're very inactive. Their activity is very low, and at about 5 to 6 o'clock, then their activity goes up. We had some other data from camera traps in another wilderness area outside of sort of further north in New York. And what's interesting here is you can see we had quite a lot of activity in the early morning in the Adirondacks, which would have been rush hour in Albany, New York. And so the animals in Albany seem to really avoid that period of time. So this is something that's been seen in other species where it seems like across the world, a lot of species are becoming more nocturnal to avoid humans. And it seems like that's part of what fishers were doing. So the tracking data we got was really, really great. Sometimes it was as accurate, it was as frequent as every 2 minutes. And you can really see the high detail resolution of where these animals are going. This is the Mohawk River. It was frozen at the time of year when we were studying, so we were able to run across the river. And you can really see the detail of where they're going. And a lot of times they were using unclaimed habitats at night. So here's a golf course. No one's golfing in Albany at night. And you can see the fishers were running all over the place. I think it was a really good place to hunt cottontail rabbits. Here's a place where this is like an interchange between the major six-lane highway and a major sort of connector road between the two cities. And there's this little cloverleaf, the on-ramp, a little bit of forest there, and the fishers would go in there and hunt. And there was snow on the ground, so we're able to go and see exactly, how do they cross this road to get between there. And we would find often these little drainage culverts. You can see it's sort of well, I'll shoot you. I'll animate it. You can see this is Leroy the fisher. Is it going to play? Oh, it's not going to play. Anyway, he runs back and forth. He uses it a bunch. And so we use the camera traps to help confirm that. And they will occasionally cut through neighborhoods. I would sort of sneak around these neighborhoods at night, following their footprints. And sometimes they would go, here's the fisher sort of running right through someone's front yard. And they didn't want to. They would stick to the forest fragments when they could, but sometimes there was this shortcut where it would take them probably 5 kilometers to kind of run around, and they would just kind of zip through the neighborhood at night. So that's, I think, interesting how the fishers are sort of using these tunnels to go under the road so they don't get hit by cars. They're hunting these common backyard mammals like rabbits and squirrels, and they're able to come back and recolonize the cities. For sure, they were totally driven out from the area beforehand. So I want to move on a little bit and talk about coyotes in North America. This is a camera trap picture of a coyote, obviously. So coyotes were originally only in the western United States. They were sort of arid lands and deserts and grasslands. They were not in the big forests in the East Coast at all. They weren't in the northern forest. They weren't in the tropical forest. They weren't in the temperate rainforest. But around 1900, they started rapidly expanding. So this is the map we made showing that expansion. You can see the red areas where they originally occurred. You can see they moved north into Alaska. They moved west into the Pacific Northwest rainforests of Washington and Oregon. They moved south into the tropical areas, and they colonized the east. And what's interesting is if you look how quickly they moved through Ontario and into upstate New York, and then kind of spread on down here, compared to how slowly they kind of moved through Ohio, Pennsylvania, and this way. And what we found was that the animals up here hybridized with wolves. And so the animals that colonized this northern route here had more wolf genes. We measured their skulls, and we found that they had a little bit, they had larger skulls, especially slightly larger. We found that they actually also had some dog genes. The ones down here that moved this way also had some dog genes. But we found that the group that had more wolf genes, they rapidly evolved larger body size and skulls, and they colonized 5 times faster than the ones that had less wolf genes. And more recently, working with Bridget Van Holt, we've looked at a bunch of these animals, and you can see some of them are very funny looking, like that red one. Here's a really dark one. Here's one with ridiculously shaggy hair that comes from a dog gene that's only known in, it's the only animal that's been found in wild animals other than dogs. We actually were able to look at some specific wolf genes that were selected for. So within the genome of an animal, if you have a good enough resolution, you can tell if there's positive or negative selection for specific genes. And we found positive selection for certain genes that originated from wolves. And in some of these cases, we actually had some idea of what the genes do from the dog genome or from the human genome. And a lot of them were associated with body size types of things. So we don't know exactly what they were doing, but they're associated with skeletal. There's a growth factor receptor, and there's some other things that affect dentition, fur, and etc. So it does seem that the wolf genes have helped the eastern coyotes adapt and evolve into a slightly larger coyote. They're still coyotes, right? They're nowhere close to wolves. They're not. They seem to have about 8% of their genes from wolves and about 8% from dogs. So they're still mostly coyote. They're still sort of 85% coyote. But they did this hybridization allowed them to more rapidly adapt to this modern eastern United States. Another kind of cool result we got recently was working with Liz Heppenheimer. We compared some of the genes that were different east to west, and we found that there's certain genes associated with boldness and exploration that are more common in the eastern animals. So if you think about all eastern coyotes are offspring of recent immigrants, of long-distance immigrants, right? And so if you have 2 coyotes that are born from a litter, the one that's more likely to run far away when they disperse is going to be more likely to colonize the East Coast. And there's certain genes that are associated with that. So there are genes associated with movement, exploration, and spatial learning that we found to be more common in eastern coyotes than western coyotes. And I put this map up to show it's not like hugely more common, right? It's statistically significant. But so if you look at the dark blue parts, the dark blue genes are more common in the east than they are in the west. But they still occur in the west. So I want to point out that it's not a huge difference, but it is a sign that we can see that that the eastern animals might be sort of moving or exploring or have different genes for spatial memory at a different rate than western animals. And just also as a cool example of what we can do with the genetic techniques that are available and all the genomic information we know about what these genes actually do. So I want to talk a little bit, just for a second, about what's going on down here, because you notice they're also moving south into Panama. We found them now about up to Lago Baiano, and actually a colleague of mine just got some pictures in the Darien, which is kind of the last big forest gap between the coyotes and South America. So it does seem like they're definitely moving towards South America. We don't have any genetic information about them yet, but they kind of look doggish, some of these pictures. And there's one trait in particular. We've got a bunch of different animals with this really short tail that we've seen in like 3 or 4 different places. So it doesn't seem to just be like one animal that got in a fight with a jaguar, but it seems to be, and there is a dog gene for short tails. So it's possible that that's being spread. So we think that the dog breeding happens when, the first coyote that enters Panama there's no other coyotes to breed with, and there's a bunch of dogs running around, and it's the male dogs and the female coyotes that seem to be doing the breeding. And then once more coyotes show up, they don't need to breed with dogs because there's lots of dogs around, and so they're more likely to kill the dogs than they are to breed with them. But that's when we think the dog hybridization happened in North America and South America. So we're talking about cities, though, and so I want to talk about a little bit about coyotes in cities. This is a great bit of artwork from the Walrus magazine. Coyotes are found in cities quite often, and especially in the western United States, but increasingly in the eastern United States. And again, I want to bring up the different kind of life they could encounter in the rural areas versus the urban areas, right? There are a lot of people that hunt coyotes in the rural areas. There are contests, there are derbies, there's a general dislike of coyotes. This is a picture from rural Maine, I think. That just doesn't happen in the cities. We can't hunt them. It's very difficult to trap them in cities because people are you pretty much have to use foothold traps, and trappers are worried about getting dogs or cats in those. So I think it's interesting. I'm going to come back to this in a little bit. So we wanted to look at how much coyotes are really in these eastern cities and also other wildlife as well. So we did this urban to wild gradient study where we worked. This is an example of a map from Washington, D.C. And so you can see the real urban areas over there in the red, the suburban areas, and you get into what we call exurban, eventually rural, and then on the wild is Shenandoah National Park. And this map is just made from housing density, but that's correlated with road density and all kinds of different things. So it's just kind of the overall development level. And then the gray dots are where we worked with citizen scientists to run camera traps. So we didn't run the cameras. We worked with volunteers who run the cameras. They uploaded the pictures to us through the mammal system, and we were able to validate all the pictures. So we verified the species in there. We also did this in Raleigh, North Carolina, which has we did this in all directions outside of Raleigh. And within each of these zones, we worked with volunteers to run cameras like right in backyards, in small forests that would be kind of near backyards, in large forests that would be larger than 1 square kilometer, and then out also some in open areas like cemeteries or golf courses that are sort of developed but don't have necessarily a whole lot of people activity. And so we published this last year. We made a little video. I'll show you part of that. So we wanted to directly compare this with exactly the same methodology, right? So having these camera traps is great because it gives us a direct comparison across these different areas and allowed us to directly compare. And we did find a lot of wildlife living in the urban areas and even right in people's backyards. So some species like bear and bobcat were more common in the wild areas, but a lot of other species were more common in the urban areas. And it was these green spaces that were actually better at predicting where the wildlife was than these bigger scale measures of development. And we get some cute fox videos as well. So this is what the results look like, for example, for coyotes in DC and Raleigh in terms of sort of their relative abundance in these different areas. And you can see, if anything, we had fewer coyotes in the wild areas than we did in the rural or exurban. And I was really surprised, actually, at how many we had in the suburban areas, because we just don't see them, right? They're actually really shy, and they're still relatively shy in Raleigh. I know in other parts of North America, I went to Tucson, Arizona, and saw like 5 coyotes in 2 days. I've seen 2 coyotes in 6 years in North Carolina. So they're just not either not as common or still more shy, or I thought they weren't there, but apparently they're there because when you put the camera traps out, you get them. And we can make these kind of graphs for all the different species and see, for example, I was saying that bobcats were still more often in the wild and rural areas. Red foxes seem to be our most sort of urban specialist of the group of species. Raccoons that are kind of these famous urban animals, well, they're also pretty common in the other places. So they're doing quite well. Also, the herbivore species we get pictures of, and this is a lot to take in, but just, for example, we have fox squirrels, woodchucks, deer, turkey, cottontail, possum, gray squirrel, chipmunk that we can look at. And these are, of course, food for the carnivore species that I was showing you before. So overall, in terms of the diversity, which is shown on this graph, or relative abundance, which is shown on that graph, relative to housing density, you can see that, if anything, there's a slight rise towards suburban areas. When you get into the really, really urban areas, which we sampled in DC but not Raleigh, there's definitely a decline. And again, with housing density, definitely in DC, we saw an increase in relative abundance. In Raleigh, it was relatively flat or maybe a slight increase. So again, these zones didn't really tell us much. It was these local measures of green space that had better predictive power in our models than these sort of broader scale ranges. So one of the things we wanted to ask was, well, how does this compare with sort of globally? Like, is this, these are carnivores, they're predators, they play ecological roles. Are they is this sort of a healthy ecosystem? Does this have normal amounts of predators? And so we use measures of occupancy, the percentage of sites that were occupied by a species, as kind of a measure of relative abundance. It's not perfect, but it's something we can compare around the world. And so there are these measures of from global, this is a global average from a recent paper that compared wild areas around the world and gave the occupancy values for predators, for carnivores, in all these different areas. So this kind of gave us, okay, this is on average, what we see in natural areas around the world. And, the point is, across our different zones, both in Raleigh and DC, we find comparable levels of carnivore occupancy. So this makes us think that, yes, this isn't like an imbalanced ecosystem in the urban areas where, there's no predators in the urban area, well, maybe not urban, but suburban areas at least. This makes us think that actually there is probably sort of a balance. And in fact, we've looked at this relationship a little bit more with coyotes and cats, feral/domestic cats. We looked at where we got cats on cameras and where we got coyotes on cameras. And this was a fun paper because it had a nice simple result that we could use as the title of the paper, which was Cats Are Rare Where Coyotes Roam. And I like to use Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C. as an example. Rock Creek Park is a kind of a long, skinny natural area that's right in Washington, D.C. I mean, there must be tens of thousands of cats that could walk into Washington, D.C. This was the only cat picture we got in our cameras in Rock Creek Park, and we had like 125 coyote pictures. So I think it's a sign that these carnivores, and coyotes in particular, are playing ecological roles. In this case, are keeping potentially invasive species out of the areas. So one more thing on coyotes and urban coyotes. I talked about this hunting difference between urban and rural areas. And we wanted to know, is this having an effect on the behavior of coyotes? In particular, their boldness, right? So a bold coyote in rural North Carolina is probably going to get shot. And a bold coyote in urban North Carolina, not going to get shot. Maybe more likely to get the cheeseburger or whatever type of extra food, kill the cat near someone's house. And so it seemed like there was some possibility that the boldness, as a general measure, would be different across these different areas. And Stuart Breck and Julie Young just published a paper on this, comparing urban Colorado with rural Utah that was nearby. And they used something called a novel object test, where you put out a novel object and you see how the coyote responds to that using the camera trap. I worked with a student, James Brooks, to do a similar thing in North Carolina, only we just used the camera trap as a novel object. So we didn't put anything in front of the camera, but the camera trap itself, the sitting on a tree, is something new. And so we used the coyote's response to the camera trap and just said, well, first of all, did they notice the camera trap or not? Most of the times they don't notice the camera trap. But if they notice the camera trap, do they approach the camera or do they ignore or run away from the camera? And what we found was a big difference where they ordered a little bit funny, but the wild animals almost never, the wild animals never approach the camera trap. And you can see the exurban and rural and suburban animals were more likely to approach the camera trap, yes approach, than no not approach. So it does seem like we're finding across North Carolina a tendency for the urban, or at least exurban animals to be more bold. So in terms of our citizen science projects, we're now expanding not just to the urban wild gradient around Raleigh, but we have a grant from the Wildlife Commission to expand across the state. So we have a project called North Carolina's Candid Critters, where we're working to get volunteers to help us run cameras in all 100 counties across the state. You can see how far we're doing here with the number of deployments that have been run. And so one of the first challenges we faced was like, okay, great, we have a grant. We're going to buy 500 camera traps, but how do we get 500 camera traps to thousands of volunteers across 100 counties? Someone in my group had the great idea of working with local libraries. And so we now have these little camera kits that you can borrow from one of, I think we're up to 50 libraries now across the state. Once you've taken our training, we tell the library so-and-so can check out the camera trap. You can borrow the camera trap, run it. You can run it on your own property, or you can go, we have permits for a lot of the public properties. You can also go on public property using one of our permits into a state park or a game land or something like that. And then upload the data. So we've now worked with people to run cameras at 3,800 sites across the state. Again, we review all the pictures. So we found that 94% of the times they set a camera trap, it's usable data. Sometimes they set it up wrong. Sometimes a bear comes and wrecks it, which isn't really their fault, but it happens sometimes. We're getting a lot. This is slightly out of date. I think we have 40-some thousand deer pictures now, but it's still the same ratio. We get a lot of deer. Deer are by far the most common animal in North Carolina in terms of our detections. We get a lot of gray squirrels as number 2. You can see some of the other examples here. And what I thought was interesting was to look at bobcat, which I think is like the 12th most common species we've got. So not a lot, but in 1 year we got 155 records of bobcats, and so that's a photograph. We can verify the species. So if someone tells me they saw a bobcat, how do I know for sure it was a bobcat? Maybe it was a cat, maybe it was a dog. But now I can verify, yes, that's a bobcat. What's interesting was I looked at what else do we know about bobcats in North Carolina? If you look at all the museum records of bobcats collected in North Carolina, there's 24 records. So we had, in terms of spatial information about where bobcats live in North Carolina, we got way more than that in 1 year, and it's still a verifiable record. This is what I really like about camera traps and citizen science, is we can verify what they saw, what they say, because we have these photographic vouchers. We also have really good measures of effort, right? If someone goes bird watching, you don't necessarily know how far they walked or how long they went or how good they are at identifying bird calls. But if a volunteer sets a camera trap, you can tell when it was put out, when it was picked up, and you can verify all the species. And so what's interesting, if you look at a lot of what we know about the biodiversity, about mammals, comes from museum specimens that give us a voucher, skin, and a tag that says where that was collected. If you look at the largest museum mammal collection in the world, is the Smithsonian. They have just shy of 600,000 specimens. It's about 2 times larger than the next specimen, the next mammal collection, and it dates from 1838. The e-mammal camera trap database that we've set up now in collaboration with the Smithsonian is now over 1 million records since 2011. So in terms of georeferenced vouchered locations of mammals that you can verify with a photograph, we've now passed, and we are now sort of the largest collection. Now, of course, there's a lot more you can do with museum specimens that you can't do with a photograph, right? So I don't want to say that we're replacing them, but if you want to talk about monitoring animals in a population and seeing what's going on today, the camera traps can work a lot faster. I want to talk a little bit about some of the other things that we do with our citizen science camera trapping projects. We have a number of school curricula that we developed, so we work with some kids to run camera traps as part of their classrooms. We work with the teachers. They run them with the kids. They upload the pictures to us, and then they also use them learning about graphing or learn about food webs or different. We've developed some of these different types of curricula. We've also worked with collaborators to get them into schools in other countries as well. For example, we have a project in India that's now expanding, and so the kids are running camera traps. We've also worked with schools in Mexico and Kenya, and initially I was worried about, okay, we're going to be connecting these American kids with these other places. I know these American kids are going to get deer. They're probably going to get cool things like coyotes and foxes. What are they going to get in India? I was worried they were going to get some small rodents or something, and it would be embarrassing. And then, Kenya starts turning in these pictures that are taken near their school. They got endangered rhinos. India, far from getting small rodents, they're getting gaur, they're getting the endangered dhole, and they're getting tigers. And this is such a cool picture because the tiger stops and breathes on the camera and fogs it up. And the kid who got this picture, said, told us, we got to meet him, and he said, this really showed him that the animals know that we're here in the environment. And they know that because this is the trail the tiger was found on. This is what we got during the daytime. And so we're getting some really useful information from these different areas that allows us to quantify. This is just showing that the colors are herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores. But it just kind of shows that we get, from working with kids around the world, we can get some useful information about what's going on in these developed areas. So we're working also not just with kids in schools, but with our volunteers and the general public to try to help connect people with nature through camera trapping. We have a bunch of social media networks or accounts with our projects where we share out some cool pictures, like this coyote. I have a book, I've got a copy of it here, about camera trapping, showing some of the coolest pictures and some of the science stories behind that. We have some Twitter accounts out there. One is really great right now because it's got these fox puppies at a den. This is from last year, but they're about the same age this year right now. So if you go to Camp Trap Live on Twitter, you can see these fox puppies running around. And there's a coyote that comes by and tries to get in the hole, tries to steal the food that the moms bring. So it should be, it's pretty interesting. So check it out if you're on Twitter. If you're not on Twitter, you can still check out the cute fox puppies. We also do some videos talking about the camera trap pictures. This is our you won't believe how many legs this coyote has. What do you think? I don't know. You have to check it out, right? So it's clickbait, right? We make up these titles, but we try to get people, and we've got a guy from the Wildlife Commission there helping me to talk about coyotes. This is another one we did where we talked about coyote hybridization. And since I know something about coyote hybridization, we had me interview myself through the magic of television at the museum. We also have some newsletters. We do some webinars with our volunteers where they can ask questions, and we'll answer them right on Facebook Live. We have some free T-shirts that if you run Camera Trap for a year with our project, you get one of these cool T-shirts. You can see that a lot of people are likely to continue with the project because they enjoy running the camera trap, seeing the pictures. And so we've also found by surveying our volunteers that by running camera traps, they increase their connection with nature. They actually increase their science efficacy, which is great because we try to engage them with science in general, not just wildlife. And we're seeing some effects of that. And they're more likely to teach others about local mammals and conservation, right? They're sharing their pictures on Facebook. They're talking to their neighbors about what they've got in their backyard. And they become local advocates for the wildlife that they see on their cameras. So just to kind of wrap up, the take-home messages from the talk, animals are still evolving. They're not static. What I read in my textbooks in the 1990s about fishers is completely different than today. We've seen this with wolves. We've seen this with fishers. We've seen this with coyotes. And sometimes involving some genetic change as well from hybridization. So, animals are dynamic, and I think protecting from overharvest is really important because evolution needs this variation, right? If we reduce them to really, really small populations, they're not going to have the variation they need to evolve and respond to the changing environment. And many of these wildlife species are doing great in developed areas. They're probably doing better than some of the other birds or insect species that are not as adaptable in their environment. So I don't mean to say that urbanization is great for all nature, but for some of these wildlife species like red fox, gray fox, raccoon, squirrel, cottontail, coyote, all these species are doing really well in some of these developed areas. And citizen science is really a great tool for studying urban animals and for connecting people with nature. So I'll end with, if you think about, well, how far can animals adapt? How much can they really change? Someone sent me this picture. It's a fisher on the beach. So if you think about this animal that used to be considered an old growth specialist that need this continuous canopy over his head all the time, here's an animal running out on the beach. So I thought this was as far as it would go. Then I got this picture in 2014 of a fisher in the Bronx of New York. They're running down the sidewalk, and I thought, they love tunnels and holes. If they figure out how to, go down the tunnels and start hunting rats, it could be we could have a seriously urban Fisher. And so I thought that was as crazy as it could get. And then this picture came in of a kind of rooftop coyote. I can just imagine them jumping from rooftop to rooftop and colonize cities. Probably not. This guy wasn't up there for very long. But anyway, that's the end of the talk. And if we have time, I'll take some questions. Thank you.
Yeah, we do have time. So, who wants to ask a question? I'll just pass you the microphone, and then people that are online can also hear your question.
Very nice and interesting. You paint a fairly rosy story. What about attitudes to these animals? I mean, when the coyotes start taking cats, when you get deer starting to chew on what's in your garden and things like that. How has this affected the attitude?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I've got a whole other talk about that. And so, definitely the coyotes are causing problems in a lot of these cities. They're killing cats. They're starting to kill small dogs. They don't seem to kill big dogs, but they definitely seem to have a thing against chihuahuas. And in California, it's happening. I mean, there's a number of cases where coyotes are jumping over like 7-foot cement fences, getting into a backyard and killing a chihuahua. There's an example of a coyote jumping through a window to kill a chihuahua next to a sleeping baby. There have been some attacks by coyotes on people. That's not been that much of a problem. It has happened. I mean, if it happens, it's a problem. But relatively speaking, the dogs and cats are the things that people are getting most upset about. And it's a tricky thing because what are you going to do about it? Right? It's hard to trap them. Even if you do trap them, more animals are going to come in. So they found that trapping coyotes to reduce density doesn't work very well because they have so many roaming. About 50% of coyote population on average are non-territorial animals that are running around looking for a territory. So if you remove some animals, those animals tend to come in very quickly. But I do think the hunting and trapping can be important for changing their behavior. So I think reducing their population, not necessarily. I don't mean to gloss over the fact that some people are going to be unhappy with wildlife living close to them. The deer come in my backyard. I've had to put a fence around my garden to reduce that. They eat some of the other plants that we don't have fenced. I'm okay with that, but other people might not. I think what's interesting is that a lot of times there's this difference between if you've grown up and there have always been deer or bear around, you're much more accepting than if that wasn't the way it used to be and now it's different. And now the coyotes are in causing problems. So there's a good example in North Carolina. Asheville, North Carolina has a ton of urban bears. And they cause problems. They eat people's garbage and people are just like, oh, those bears. And they just like them. They like bears. They like nature. Asheville's kind of a naturey city. And they like them. And there's other places where bears are newly moving into cities where there's still a lot of conflict and they're upset about it. And so I think that's an interesting dynamic about people's attitudes of getting someone. So we have elk, red deer, what you guys call them, in North Carolina are new. They've been reintroduced. They're starting to expand. And there's some people that are upset about it. Some people love it. But it's the same kind of thing where it's like these farmers have never had to deal with elk and now they have to deal with elk. And it's a hassle and they're upset about it. So I think that's an interesting dynamic. And how do you get people to sort of adapt and change? Maybe it's harder to get people to change than the animals. I don't know.
More questions?
I have a critically important question. What is that animal on your belt buckle?
Oh, the belt buckle's an armadillo.
Everybody know the Swedish word for armadillo? Belt animal is the literal translation.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Maybe this was made in Sweden. I don't know.
Well, so when you go back home, it's doubly appropriate that you're wearing a belt animal on your belt.
How do you say that in Swedish?
Väldigt
Okay, good. Yeah, armadillos are interesting. They're just at the edge. North Carolina's at their edge of their range, so it's kind of interesting to see if they're expanding north from climate change. They used to be expanding north, and they seem to have slowed down a lot. So that's one of the species we're looking for in our camera traps. We've gotten, I think, one picture of an armadillo so far. So.
Now, you remember that as a little tidbit from Sweden. That's a belt animal.
Thanks.
Do you have any information about fishers taking cats as well?
Yeah, fishers taking cats is something that I hear about a lot. especially from people in New Hampshire. They really seem to be upset. The state of New Hampshire, they're always talking about fishers killing their cats. I have no evidence that fishers have ever killed a cat. Could they kill a cat? For sure. But do they do it often? For sure not. Coyotes are much more likely to kill a cat, I think, and owls are much more likely to kill a cat. We've looked at the diet of fishers. We never found cat. We've looked at. I've been snow tracking and seen fisher tracks cutting cat tracks all the time, and I found fisher kills of mice and birds and things like that. I've never seen a rabbit or a cat kill. In the literature, there's actually no physical evidence that fishers have actually ever killed a cat. It's never showed up in a diet study, but I think they could. I think it'd be a bit risky for sure. It would have to be a bigger male cat fisher to go after a cat. And if it was some cats are wimpy pussy cats, and some cats are big mean tomcats. So I think that would kind of make a difference. But I think what's interesting is fishers are relatively new. So people in New Hampshire, for example, and New York, the suburban areas, they're starting to get aware that there's this new thing called fisher, and so they sort of blame things on it, like the dead cats. The other thing I often hear is that fishers scream, and there's a bunch of YouTube videos about the fisher scream, and it's someone sitting outside with their video, and it's just blackness, and you hear this animal screaming, and it's always either a fox or a raccoon, but they always call it, they often attribute it to a fisher. Fishers don't scream, as far as I've been able to tell, and I've actually talked to Roger Powell, who's had them as pets, and he said no, they don't scream. And when I've listened to these videos, it's usually a raccoon or a fox. It's usually a fox, and so it's another example, I think, where when these animals come back into suburban areas that have never been there, they're new, and some people don't like them and have problems with them, and some people blame problems like cats or screaming weird things at night on the new animals, even though it's some fox that's been there forever.
I'm wondering about the citizen science project. Like, who's the typical volunteer? Like, who, do you have any statistics on that?
We do. I don't have them handy, but we do. We have been taking age and sex and that kind of thing. But it tends to be nature lovers who are interested in nature in the first place, and they tend to be often a little bit older, have a little bit more time on their hands. What we ask of them is more than the average citizen science project. It's not just taking a picture on their phone and sending it someplace. It's doing a certain protocol. They have to go through the training. They have to look at all the pictures and identify them. And so it tends to, I think, people have a little bit more time on their hands. But we've also had some homeschoolers do it with their parents. We've had kids do it for science fair projects. So we've had some college classes do it as projects. The undergrads actually turn out to be some of our worst volunteers. Even when I have them in my class do it, and even when they're graded, a lot of them just do a crappy job. I don't know what the problem is. So far, we haven't had that many hunters involved. Hunters already own cameras, but they're already setting cameras, and they set them often different than we set them. They often put bait in front, and we don't want people to put bait in front. And so they're kind of like, well, I'm already doing it, and I don't want to do it your way, so I'm just going to keep doing it my way. So we've had relatively little involvement of hunters. We do have about 20% of the people that work with us already own a camera and are using it. So some of those are going to be hunters, but some of them are just running cameras for fun anyway. So about 20% of the people are using their own camera.
Yeah, about the hunters using this kind of cameras, I guess. Yeah. Sorry. So about the hunters using this kind of camera, I guess that would be a formidable tool. This camera, the traps, to control those populations. So have you thought about this, or how that?
Sorry, because I thought about what?
That this type of program could be used as a way to control the populations and maybe hunt them, know where they are.
To use the camera data to know where the animals are to hunt them. Yeah. Go ahead. It's legal to hunt animals, right? And so we do provide all the data. It's out there. It's not you have to sort of download a text file and do some analyses. But we do provide the county level map. and show relative abundance of different animals per county. So technically someone could go on our system and see, oh, this site had a really high deer population last year, so I'm going to go and hunt there. They could do that. And I guess I don't really care. It's not an endangered species, it's doing hunting anyway, and that's why hunters are running cameras anyway, right, is to find these spots. A lot of our cameras are run on private land, so you would need permission to hunt there anyway. Some of our cameras are run in state parks where there's no hunting allowed, but there are some of our cameras that are run on public land where you would be able to go and go to that exact spot and hunt if you wanted to. I guess, I don't know of anyone that's done that, but I don't, it would be data from, 6 months or a year ago or something like that. But you could, and that's, so when we're working now, we work on, with camera traps, and we have the eMammal database, and we're working now on a new global wildlife insights database of camera trapping data. And when we have sensitive species that are either on the IUCN Red List, or that the person who started the project said, this is a sensitive species, I don't want to give this information away, the location information for those are fuzzed. And so it's a generic, it's a very generic location, like the center of the park or something like that. So you would know that species exists in this area, but you wouldn't be able to sort of know the exact place. And so we do put those controls on for cases where we're concerned about poaching or illegal harvest. But in North Carolina, there's nothing we're really that concerned about in that way.
Time for one last question. Who wants to have the last question?
Chris, great.
Thanks for your talk. I'm just wondering about the hybridization of wolves and the coyotes, and I'm not sure how that relates to urban phenomena. Really, I mean, they've hybridized prior to their extinctions regionally, I'm guessing. So
yeah.
I don't really know where you were getting at with that.
Well, it's part of their colonization story to start with. And so it's part of, we never had coyotes anywhere in the East, and hybridization is part of the way that the way they're able to expand. But I think the reason it's important when thinking about urban coyotes and the evolution of urban coyotes in the East is when you think about the variation that evolution is acting on. And so what hybridization does is it makes more variation, more types of variants, because you have all these genes from dogs and from wolves that are mixing in. And so I showed some examples about how these wolf genes are being selected for. We haven't looked specifically urban versus wild, but that eastern coyotes have these wolf genes that are helping to make them larger. So there are, moving forward, what I'm interested in particular are these boldness genes. There are genes associated with bold animals and bolder behavior, and so we're interested if those are being selected for. And so I think the point of the hybridization is that it makes more variation that evolution can select on to create, ecotypes or, subspecies or populations that are sort of locally adapted to the evolutionary pressures at a specific area. So inside a city versus outside the city, one city versus another city. You could have different things going on in different areas with the specific coyotes, and the amount of dog and wolf genes that they have mixed in could change sort of the possibilities that they have for evolution to act on.
So the